Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming. This is the Hungry Math Professor here, and thanks for coming to my channel to check this out. Today, we're going to discuss Blindness by Jose Saramago. And I really like this book, and I highly suggest that you read it, though I will say it is quite disturbing at times. And so you should make the decision. You should know yourself and whether that's something, these kinds of disturbing images are something that you want to do in your spare time or not is up to you, and a matter of question of how you know yourself. But I would say this is a very good book to read and reflect on. And from my point of view, um, I want to look at these kind of ugly things because I think when we look at these ugly like truths about humanity, we um, are forced to just look at the truth and examine who we really are. But anyway, I'll say more about that as we develop the discussion a little bit. The book was written in 1995, and Saramago won the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1998. And as I understand it, this was one of the main books uh, that was attributed to him winning the Nobel Prize. Um, so what happens in this book? Again, these discussions are discussions, so I will give away the plot. And so if you haven't read the book and you don't want me to give away some of the plot, then you should come back and watch my discussion after you read. Um, but if you read the back cover, you're going to find out what I'm about to say, which is, the book starts out with one main character becoming blind suddenly, and we never know why. But eventually, several more people become blind. And so the society is not sure what to do about this. We don't know why these people are becoming blind. And so I'm going to say we throughout the discussion because I think this book is not about any particular society. It's about humans in general. So I think when I use the word we here, I'm talking about humans in general or humanity. So what do? We quarantine these people. And at first, there's only so many of them, on the order of tens to hundreds. And so we quarantine them in a hospital, and we quarantine the people who have become blind. And we also quarantine the people who were directly in contact with those who became blind. And it starts out with a pretty reasonable system. Like the blind people will be kept on one half of the hospital, and the people who are in contact with the blind people will go on the other half of the hospital. And when the people who are in contact with the blind people eventually become blind, if they do, then we'll move them over to the blind category, right? And it's done in a somewhat humane way. I mean, you can debate whether the quarantine people is how humane that is, but they have some good intentions. We're going to drop off food every day and medical supplies, and we're going to take care of these people as best we can. Okay, so that's the beginning situation, but as this progresses, more and more people become blind. And eventually the number of people becoming blind is getting out of control, and this hospital is just not big enough to house all these people. And some of the beginning disturbing images that we get are just how rancid this hospital is becoming. I mean, there's just to not mince word, there's just shit and piss everywhere in this hospital. And it's disgusting. And Saramago will describe some of these scenes, and it's just gross. And I mean, these people are blind, so it's hard for them to avoid this excrement that's all over the floors. They have to find the bathroom, but they're having a hard time avoiding this excrement while they're walking to the bathroom. And also, they're blind, so it's not like they can. There's no one to lead them to the bathroom or to set up a system where they can find the bathroom on their own. So there's a lot of issues here as the number of blind people pile up. But that sort of initial disturbing grossness of the hospital eventually becomes even more intense. And eventually the food being delivered is maybe not as as um, regular as you would like, but also eventually a certain group of people in the hospital gets the idea that they could control the whole situation by just controlling the food. and one of them has a gun somehow, and so but they're all blind, but still they somehow take control of some central office that's near the opening to the hospital, and they're going to control the food coming in. And by controlling the food coming in, they control this whole sort of simple society that's been set up in this hospital now. That's the sort of the simple situation. And, at this point, I just want to say that, this book is in a lot of ways a metaphor or a parable to the human condition and just humanity in general. So you're not, when you read this book, you're not going to get like these great characters, and it's not really even about character development per se. You're not going to get like a lot of just great, beautiful story, tied to these characters. That's not what this book is for. In fact, most of the characters don't even get names. We don't necessarily find out that much detail about them, except for a small group of about, 8 to 10 characters who we do learn a little bit about, but even them we learn very little about. And then the main female character who never goes blind, again, we don't learn a terrible lot about her, but she is sort of the main point of contact throughout the book because she never goes blind. And she winds up in the hospital because she pretends to be blind. And her husband has actually gone blind, as one of the first people to go blind. So, anyway, my point is just that this book is not about the characters per se, or there's not going to be a lot of great character development, and it's not about the story involving them. It's just a big parable about humans and the human condition and about society. And so, as I talk about the plot, I think it's important to remember that the plot is to serve this parable, and you don't want to get too caught up in the individual characters. And I think even just like how believable the characters are, again, we can talk about that because it's an interesting way to talk about the book, but I think it misses the point. It's not about the characters. I'm not even sure that the characters on as their own individuals are supposed to be extremely believable or not. Also, you can ask like, why does this one character not lose her vision? And I mean, I think I'd be curious if you have another reason besides what I'm about to say, but I think it's just purely practical. I mean, if all the characters are blind, then it would be very hard for Saramago to do anything with these characters that's even remotely believable. So I think it's a very practical thing. He needs a character to not be blind, and that character is going to drive the action, because otherwise, all the characters, you know, are not going to be able to do very much here. And again, just to think about this parable a little bit, it's not obviously blind people can be very capable in society. We know that, but what you should think about here is, and again, you shouldn't get too bogged down in the specifics of blindness here. Instead, what you should be thinking about is if, as a society, we all go blind more or less at the same time. The issue is that we haven't built society in a way to deal with that, right? The way we build society now, there are a certain percentage of blind people, and but so we can build structures in place for them, but also those structures are built in a way that we know that 90%, or it's probably way more than that, but a large percentage of people are not going to be blind. But if everybody goes blind at the same time, society has not been built to handle that sort of reality, right? And so immediately we have to confront the fact that we we haven't set things up to deal with that, right? And if we were all blind from the very beginning, then we would have set society up differently, and we would be able to figure it out, right? We could potentially, there'd be no problem figuring that out. I mean, it's an interesting thought experiment to think about what the world would look like if we were all blind. I'm not going to go there with too much detail, but I think it is an interesting little thought experiment. But that would be a much different world than where we live in now. So part of the parable here, that I want to emphasize, is just, one way to look at it is just when something big like that happens all of a sudden, um, you know, we have to, as a society or as human beings, deal with the deterioration of all this structure that we put on the world and put on society that now doesn't quite work. And when all that deteriorates around us, because we're all blind now and we can't interact with the world the way we set it up, we're forced into this sort of this raw state of nature where our needs are very simple again. We've always needed food and drink, but now somehow our needs have been reduced down to just food and drink for the most part, right? And that's a very difficult need to meet in this situation. Anyway, so back into the hospital, these certain group of men take over control. And again, this is I think again this should be seen as a parable of, you know in these situations where society breaks down and chaos, we're in somewhat of a chaos situation. It's natural and not good perhaps, but it's natural for a certain subset of those people to try to take control. To control the food in this case is to control the needs of basically everybody in this hospital. And at first, these group of men, now that they have control, they want to milk some things for themselves out of this control. So they start asking people to like give up any of their valuables, right? Any gold or jewelry. And as you're reading this, if you're reflecting on what the situation that they're in, you sort of realize right away, like, what's the use of gold or jewelry or any of those things? Like, again, these people are acting in their old understanding of society. Gold has no value in this new society. What are you going to do with it? Right? These jewelry and any valuables that were valuable the way society was set up before are not valuable anymore. But anyway, that's their first attempt to try to like milk some benefit from this newly gained control. But if you reflect on where they find themselves now in this like very simple state of nature, there's really only two, at a very basic sense, there's only two needs here. There's food and there's sex. And they control the food. And so the next thing that they do is they try to manipulate the women in the hospital to meet their sexual needs, force them to do that. And this is the most disturbing, one of the most disturbing scenes in the book, though there's many disturbing scenes, but this is the most acutely disturbing. And it's the part where you may just not want to read it. And I will say Saramago is quite descriptive in this part about the scenes. And you can wonder about why he's so descriptive about this part. Um, I'll let you comment if you have more to say about this. But I will say, I do think he is trying to deeply disturb us. And it didn't have to be quite this way, but this is one way of doing it. I think he's just trying to point to how grotesque we can be as human beings sometimes. And, we can boil down society and who we are as human beings down to just forcing people to have sex with us. And he's not saying that that's good or that we should do that, but I think he's trying to say that in some way we're all capable of that. I don't know if I would go that far that we're all capable of something like that, but um, I think certainly we should all have a certain sense of humility that if society breaks down enough, maybe we wouldn't force people to have sex with us. I don't think that might be too far, but we might be forced to do things that I wouldn't do now. Maybe I would have to kill somebody, and I don't think I would kill somebody now. But in these sort of really extreme situations, I might be forced to do that. Something I don't think is something I would just do, right? And um, I don't know. I'd be curious to hear what else you have to say about this particular scenes, but they are quite grotesque. And eventually, though, there's this sort of somewhat triumphant moment where the women um, do fight back and wind up, um, inflicting harm on these characters. And I don't want to spend too much time here, but the point I think is just that this is a parable that when society breaks down, we wind up setting up these ugly systems uh, where we kind of revert back to this very simple situation and we just kind of try to control people and ugly things happen. But eventually, the characters start to realize that so many people have gone blind outside of the hospital that there's no reason for them to stay in the hospital anymore. Basically, almost everybody's blind. They're not even sending people to the hospital anymore because there's no one to do the sending, right? Almost everybody's blind. So they eventually leave the hospital, and this is like roughly halfway. And so the whole second half of the book is them trying to navigate the world outside. And now they realize, yeah, that there's lots of people out here, and they're all blind too. And as far as we can tell, the only character who is has kept their sight is this main female character, um, who doesn't get a name. And but now they are again, now they have to find food on their own. And that's a very difficult thing to do, even though there's this one character who has her sight. I mean, there's only so much she can do to try to provide food for. She winds up staying with these roughly 8 to 10 characters that becomes like they're all become their own little family unit. And if you're all blind and you haven't built society to deal with that, then it makes sense to try to stick together in somewhat of a group, right? So we see these little groups forming even in this chaotic sort of outside world, which is what, if you look back in history to how we've always been as human beings, we've always tried to clump together. And maybe we don't form societies as large as what we have now, but we try to clump together as social beings and make the best as we can together as little groups. And so the main female character and these other sort of 8 characters remain together throughout the rest of the book. And they struggle to feed themselves, and they struggle to travel around. And I'm not going to get into all those little details. But eventually, this main female character is really being pushed to her limits, and it becomes like, if you're reflecting on where this situation leads, I mean, eventually she's just not going to be able to feed them. I mean, she might not be able to feed herself either, but at some point she might just have to abandon them in order to feed herself, or maybe she's just going to have to accept the fact that they're all going to starve. Because I mean, how are they going to even develop enough food? It's just not clear that that's going to work. And it just feels very bleak. There's just a matter of time before they're all just going to starve, it seems like. And I think that's really where they're at. But then we come to the ending, and what to make of the ending? The first time I read the ending, there was part of me that felt like, so what happens at the end is they all regain their sight mysteriously, right? With no explanation as to why. And at first I thought, did he just like kind of run into a wall here and he has to just kind of come up with some ending? I don't know how I feel about this ending. They all just get their sight back. But I think, again, if we look at this as a parable, and if we think about I want to quote from one of the things that the doctor says, who's the first person to go blind, almost towards the very end of the book. He says, "I don't think we did go blind. I think we are blind, blind but seeing, blind people who can see but do not see." And again, what's interesting about this quote is there's a lot of equivocating going on here, right? The word blind and seeing is being used in several different ways. When I say equivocating, it's when you use the same word, but you use it in a different sense. So this is actually a logical fallacy to equivocate, but it can be quite pretty as like a poetic device to equivocate. But anyway, when someone equivocates like that, we have to try to um, piece together when they're using blind in one sense and when they're using blind in another sense. Anyway, I don't want to do a too meticulous, going through of that sentence, but instead I just want to say, I think, again, I think this book is a parable, right? I don't think that's a deep, insight by me. I think that's pretty clear when you read this book. And so I think his point to some degree is, first of all, that this isn't really about blindness per se. Yeah, he's using blindness throughout the book as the main driver of the action, but you can replace blindness with almost anything. And so maybe his point is that, yeah, we see again in the literal sense. All the characters see again, but in what senses were we blind to begin with? Again, not in the seeing sense, but in metaphorical sense. In what senses were we blind to certain people who weren't being taken care of? Or in what senses were we blind to some bigger needs that we have that we're not paying attention to? Or what sense are we blind to, um, are we really finding meaning, or are we just kind of like a hamster on a wheel, just trying to, keep ourselves busy? Like there's various different ways we can be blind. And I think just to take a current example that this can be a metaphor for as well as, we went through a pandemic, the COVID pandemic. And I think when I would read articles during the pandemic, there were times where people would say, we're going to learn a lot from this. And, but I think looking back, I'm not so sure that we've learned very much from that, right? We went through this, um, the COVID pandemic, sorry, and it greatly, um, disrupted our lives. Not, I think, as intensely as it would if we all went blind at the same time, but it very much disrupted our lives. And now we've come to the other side of it. And I've hoped we learned some things, but I'm not so sure we've learned as much as we should have, right? For instance, we could have another pandemic. Would we be ready? I'm not so sure. Would we make the same mistakes we made before? Um, so in the book, they see again, but are they going to learn from this situation, or are they just going to build society exactly the same way again? And I think this again is a parable for us to reflect on. Do we really learn from our mistakes? Do we really learn from history very well? What are the right things to learn from history? What are the right things to learn from our mistakes? In what ways are we actively being blind all the time as a society or as people, that is causing dysfunction, causing wars, causing us to clash up against each other in ways that is not productive? So I don't want to go on too much longer here, but I really enjoy this. I mean, this is really a book that's right up my alley. I love a big parable that makes you think. I do enjoy the idea of just kind of looking at the possible depravity that's inside of all of us and reflecting and trying to be humble and honest about that. I don't think you have to read this though as like a depressing, cynical thing. I think instead you can read it as a call to reflection, as a call to introspection, into ourselves as individuals, but introspection to society, and like what is it that we could do better, or what are the things we're being blind to, right? So anyway, I hope you enjoy this discussion. And again, if you have any points you want to add to what I said, please feel free to comment. And I'll see you at the next book discussion.